Welcome to Hacking Postgres. Today we have Marco Slot joining us. I'm meeting Marco for the first time today. I'm super excited to be meeting you, Marco. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Ryan. Yeah, very nice to meet you. So I'm Marco. I work at Microsoft, and I've been working on Postgres extensions for about 9 years now. Starting with Citus, pgcron, and a bunch of other ones.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so this is like not really supposed to be an interview. It's more just us, geeking out about Postgres extensions, what they mean to users, and opinions about anything and everything related to our work is fair game. So yeah,
sounds good.
So what'd you do before you got into Postgres stuff, out of curiosity?
Yeah, my background is more in distributed systems. So I spent a few years at AWS. It was quite early days in AWS when I think I joined. There were 3 web services: S3, SQS, and EC2.
Wow.
And then we built number
crap.
4, which was CloudFront, which because people started using S3 for websites, which it wasn't really built for. But then we were asked to solve this, and we built the CDN. And then we also built Route 53 for the DNS.
Wow.
And then I also did a PhD in sort of self-driving cars, but specifically like cooperation between self-driving cars. Like what if they can communicate with each other and sort of coordinate? So it's sort of advanced distributed systems in a way as well.
Yeah.
So that was that led to me joining Citus, which is more sort of founded by former Amazon folks.
Got it. So building Citus was probably easy compared to all the other stuff, huh?
It is actually, yeah. If you do self-driving, like cooperation between self-driving cars, which is this kind of like life-critical system where your nodes kind of just move around and they move away from each other. It does make things relatively easy, but then, building databases is never actually very easy.
No, I know. It's how good do you want to make it, right? Is how hard it becomes.
Yeah. I guess the challenge is always everything, like it's sort of in the word relational, right? Like everything relates to everything else. So there's not like a feature you can implement without considering all the other aspects of the database and all the things that can happen concurrently with the operation that you're working on, and all the possible ways in which things can fail, especially if you're in a kind of distributed setup.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting perspective. Like you think of all of the configuration options too. Like adding a new configuration option adds complexity, adds flexibility, adds potential conflicts. And it's tough.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing we learned is like there's a sort of certain danger in creating modes where every setting you add, which can be on off, like then now you have 2 modes in your system. Yeah, another setting that can be on off. Now you have 4 modes in your system. It's kind of this exponential explosion of possible ways in which your database might be running. And so that's a hard-learned lesson. That's like, don't introduce major like modes. Sometimes you have to because of backwards compatibility reasons, maybe, but it's like you want to get rid of them over time.
Yeah. So what were you one of the first team members on Citus building it? And I don't really know the full history. Did it start as a fork and made its way as an extension, or was it always an extension?
I was one of the first, though. I think Samai was already there. I think he's joined Tembo. But we started out as a fork, and then we called it Citus DB, and then we made it an extension and called it Citus. Though I think the name Citus DB kind of stuck around I still hear it sometimes. But it was very, pretty early days for extensions, like 2015. PostGIS obviously existed. It was one of the first major ones. But we were lucky at the time. We had like Andres Freund working for us. Well, he's also now working for Microsoft, but he's like one of the top Postgres committers, and we put him in a room for a while to, can you turn this into an extension, please? And he came up with some terrible hacks, but over time those also, drove some of the extension APIs in Postgres itself, where things that used to require really terrible hacks are now kind of more structured and you can introduce your own sort of data structures into Postgres without doing lots of weird stuff.
Well, I was thinking like probably not everybody knows what Citus is. Maybe if you could give a quick, I'd love to hear like a quick overview of what it is, and then maybe a couple things that maybe you can think of that are unusual that people might not know about it that are part of it. I don't know if that's a stupid question, but yeah, if you could try.
No, yeah, it's so it comes from basically the notion that Postgres is ultimately limited to a single machine. I mean, you can read replicas, but you definitely cannot scale the writes. You cannot. Usually, if you have read replicas, they'll kind of end up having the same stuff in memory, so you cannot really scale the memory either. And so Citus is a solution basically adds sharding to Postgres, where in a very transparent way, where you can have tables that are sort of transparently sharded across many nodes. You still connect to a Postgres server. There's just a table, walks and talks like a table, but if you insert into it, it actually gets routed to a particular node, and if you insert in another value, it might get routed into another node that uses this hash distribution, and that way you can scale across infinitely many machines, and have some users have petabytes of data in their Citus cluster. Part of the advantage is also that queries can get parallelized on these tables because we can use all the nodes at the same time and multiple cores per node. But more and more, it's also actually being used for OLTP workloads, and particularly the most popular use case is actually multi-tenancy, where you have like this kind of B2B app where you have lots of relatively independent users, and you kind of want to just transparently spread those across different machines without having to actually manage that yourself and figure out how to move data around, because that is all very kind of automated. You can just ask it to rebalance your data, and it does that using logical replication. And so then you have the advantage of just as much memory as you need to make your application fast, and as much disk IOPS as you need by just adding more machines with more disks. And so that helps you scale. So that's and then we have a sort of managed service in Azure around that. But yeah, it kind of like we use like every hook that's available in Postgres to achieve things, like starting with the planner hook. Like that's one of the interesting things about Postgres. It's like you just replace the whole planner with something else. Like you get a parsed query tree, and then you can do whatever you want with it. You can just do some like, okay, look at this query and log something interesting, and then just go to the regular planner. Or you could just do something completely different. And so we use all these hooks to kind of create this facade around Postgres tables, where it's like Postgres table is still there. You just cannot touch it. Like we just intercept everything that's going on. And I mean, the most recent and most terrible hack we did, it was like I would give it as hacking Postgres. It's so we can figure out what. So we have shards, like the writes go into shards, but then if you do logical decoding, you see writes on shards. You don't see writes on these what we call distributed tables. And so, but the user doesn't even know about shards probably. Like, so how can we fix that? And there wasn't really any kind of hook we could use to change the way that like the logical decoding process works. Except that we realized that the client specifies a decoder name, usually just hard-coded like PG output or wall to JSON or test decoding. And that actually refers to the name of a .so, like a shared library. And we realized we could create a .so with the same name and put it in a different directory, and then change the dynamic library paths to be prefixed with that directory, so it would load our library instead. So this is kind of the worst thing we did, but but it works nicely actually. I mean that new .so file calls the original .so file, and it kind of makes some changes to hide the sharding from the decoding output. But it's we it is a hack. It's very much a hack, but it's nice that Postgres ultimately lets you do these kind of things.
I think like Citus says, like, there's like a requirement that Citus loads first as an extension. Is that true? I'm trying to remember if I'm making that up or.
It is true. I mean, it's Maybe it's a bit of
It's
laziness on our part, but it's also because like we generate very weird like plans that wouldn't make any sense to other extensions. So if you have like multiple layers of planner hooks, you kind of want Citus to be like, so but by putting it first, it actually becomes the last because everyone else overwrites Citus, and then hopefully when you go through the chain of planner hooks, Citus is the last one remaining, and it can produce some quirky distributed query plan that doesn't make sense to anyone else, and pick that up itself. But
makes sense. Are there like known extensions that aren't compatible with Citus that you're aware of, or as far as you know, like it kind of works with most everything?
Yeah, I mean, Citus is a little bit of a paradigm shift because now you have like many servers, and you know, some extensions just don't make sense if you're on many servers because they keep their state on one of them, and then like they're not aware of others. But I mean, most things just work. But I kind of feel like there's this notion of a deep extension, if you will, like Timescale DB or Citus. They kind of go really deep into like planner hooks and change behavioral characteristics, whereas something like PostGIS and a lot of extensions that just introduce new types and functions, like they're sitting on top of this much more clean interface, and usually the interoperability of those things is pretty good. But like Timescale has this notion of a hyper table, and Citus a distributed table, and I mean, you cannot really make a distributed hyper table. But yeah, compatibility is, I mean, it comes down to sometimes also the individual features. It's not like you can like if you install one, then the other doesn't work anymore. I mean, that happens for some extensions, but for Citus, most other things just kind of work with it.
Yeah. So let's talk about pgcron. How early were you involved in that project?
Well, I created it I used to have this thing where I am much more productive on flights, and I flew to San Francisco a lot for a while, and then I had a few of these projects that I was just working on flights, and pgcron was one of them. And so at the time we had customers who did kind of this real-time analytics scenarios on Postgres, on Citus, and those involve a lot of materialization. So a bunch of raw data keeps coming in, like time series data, and at some point you want to take all the new data and kind of pre-aggregate it inside of the database, and that needs to happen periodically. Like and so I think the background worker concept was pretty new at the time. I don't know, this was many years ago. And so I realized you could do something like cron. It maybe also comes from the Amazon background, because Amazon, at least at the time, was all like glued together with cron, Perl, and rsync. Like just like there were cron jobs that would rsync metadata files to other servers, and it was all pretty hacky. But anyway, like I figured it would be pretty useful to have this kind of thing in Postgres also, for just, you know, vacuuming or calling certain stored procedures that, I don't know, delete your old data, like all those kind of maintenance tasks. It was just much easier if that's like you run a command once and then it works forever, rather than I need to maintain a separate infrastructure that periodically connects to the database and does that. So that became quite popular. Again, I think pretty much all major managed services have pgcron now. I kind of built it as it was definitely my side project. So I also built it as a very low maintenance thing that I wouldn't have to constantly, you know, fix bugs in. I'm also a little bit selective about adding new features. Like for a long time, I resisted adding, like people want, like, can I run a job every few seconds? And normally cron is like at the minute granularity, but recently I caved and I added doing it every few seconds because I realized, like, this kind of feature, like if there's some kind of issue, some kind of memory leak or whatever, like if you run it every few seconds, it's going to be way worse than if you run it once a minute. So you need to be more careful in that case. But you can now also do like every second, for example, which is kind of useful.
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah. I was looking at, we're just building a new data warehouse, trying to use Postgres to do that. You know, I'm exploring all the columnar extension as well, which sort of as part of Citus. I don't know if you did any work on that, but yeah, looking at like PG cron versus like PG timetable. Have you had the question of like, what about have you looked at timetable and its features? And yeah, I'm kind of curious to get your assessment of the two.
Yeah, I've looked at it a bit. I mean, for a long time, it wasn't so much an extension. I think nowadays they are. It is more or less an autonomous extension, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's somewhat more complex. Yeah, and in a way, it doesn't. I don't feel like competitive of like you should use PG cron or use PG timetable. I think PG cron is just like intentionally simple, just this very simple thing that just works and does what you'd expect it to do. I mean, almost, unless your time zone is in a different, unless you're not in GMT, then it sort of doesn't quite do what you'd expect it to do. But anyway, so yeah, I think cron is just simpler, but I mean that has like, if you need some more specific, like, I guess it comes down to, do you need the extra features that PG timetable adds? But I think for most people, PG cron is good enough, because you can also just, like, I've also seen people do like their own kind of job queues on top of PG cron, where you just have this thing that runs every few seconds or every minute, and then looks, are there some jobs to do, and it actually executes the stuff that's in the jobs table. So it's kind of composable as well. You can build your own things on top if you want. Yeah,
and especially if you could trigger it every second, to check for work. That's just fine. I'm coming from my previous company was doing Apache Airflow, and so it's like kind of getting back to some of the stuff. I mean, obviously that's a very complicated system with a lot of capabilities, and DAG, like, chaining of tasks and fanning out and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's interesting to try to do some of that stuff inside of Postgres without requiring. I'm trying to, we're trying to go with the mantra of like, just use Postgres for everything, and it's not a bad mantra. It's like, I mean, some of the you've got, I guess, different levels of commitment to that idea of, how much of our backend can we shove into Postgres? And, there's these GraphQL extensions where you pretty much put your entire backend in Postgres. Yeah, your API is there.
Yeah, I guess Supabase is going a pretty long way in that direction. But, at some point there is like, you want to debug stuff, or you want to have certain like rollout procedures, and there are sometimes Postgres is not like as mature a tool as just shipping like Python files somewhere. Like there's just better CI tools for most normal programming languages than for Postgres procedures. So you have to find the right balance, I think. We're building, and maybe this shouldn't have happened, but apparently yesterday, like, we were working on a new FDW, and I think it hit an exception that wasn't handled, and it appeared to shut down the Postgres server. So that's kind of fun. Like, should that have happened? Should that be possible? Should a extension error take it down? But we're still investigating that. But I think it's there's always risk with trying to do a lot inside. But I think with a mature extension that's well tested and battle tested, it should be. I mean, if you think about everything that's happening, there's no SRP in Postgres, right? Like, it's not just doing one thing. It's got a vacuum. There's like lots of processes running, and so then the question is like, is it a sin to add one more thing? Yeah,
especially if it has the capability to have a background worker. It's just like staring you in the face, like, use me.
True. Yeah, I mean, it's they're like the extension APIs are like slowly evolving from just a complete like hacky approach for people to try out their Postgres batches before merging them into core to I mean, I guess extensibility was there from the start, but that's more true for custom types and custom functions than it is for planner hooks and background workers and those kind of things.
Yeah.
Those are a little bit more, what if we, add this function pointer to C? Maybe extensions can do something interesting with it. And it's not very extremely well structured. But I mean, the whole Rust, like PGRX and building extensions in Rust, it does create an opportunity to have a little bit more of a well-defined method of developing extensions.
Yeah. I think what's interesting to me about Postgres is like the history of forks, and it sucks to be on a true fork, as I'm sure you were aware. Creating the extension framework helps people out of the land of forks, but it does create like the possibility for even more, risk / extensions in terms of all that. So it's like a double-edged sword. I think it's great that that's to me is the reason why Postgres is doing so well now is all that freedom that the core team has given the community in terms of how to use it. It's just like it's unprecedented and almost dangerous, but I also think like empowering to developers who want to have some fun with their database.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, what we also often find is just like an extension versus an external tool. At least, I mean, we're sort of in the business of running a Postgres managed service, and but even if you have just your own Postgres servers, it has a fairly straightforward deployment model, right? Like you don't have to create a whole separate cluster with its own configuration that connects to your Postgres database and does things with it. You just shove it into your existing Postgres server, and like it'll restart the background workers, and you don't have to worry about all those things. So it does have a lot of merit actually to develop a software as a Postgres extension. I mean, it comes with its own protocol. And I mean, I think the most interesting thing is just like you get all this synergy between all these different extensions that like the sum of the parts is like greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But like, also things like PostGIS and Citus, they kind of layer, like you can distribute it geospatial joins, whatever. But then also like maybe you have some interesting function and you can run it periodically using pgcron, and it's like all these things kind of give you this little platform where you can, just by running SQL queries, do increasingly interesting things. Maybe you have an FTW that does an HTTP call and you run it using pgcron, for example. It just and now your Postgres server is not just pgcron is not just Postgres cron, it's actually anything cron. Like you can reach out to other systems. So that pluggability is extremely powerful.
I literally have a co-op that started last week, and his first task was, I said, create an FTW for this API, and use pgcron and ingest that data, and he's like, well, how do I do it? Like just brand new to like data warehousing in general, but he's got the FTW built, and now he's working on getting. If he has any problems, I'll send him your way.
Sure.
Kidding. I won't. Kidding. I won't do that.
Well, I mean, if there's bugs, open issues, like I'd like to know.
Of course. But there's no bugs. No. So, do you have any long flights coming up? Where you have some new extensions coming?
No, we had a baby last year. It's like my flight budget is very low at the moment. But,
that's true. Your latest extension is human.
Yeah. But I'd like to play more with Rust, because that. I mean, the problem with extensions in the past, like developing them in C, has always been like C doesn't have any good sort of dependency framework. Like, there's these old established library like I don't know, libc and like libxml or something that was like developed 20 years ago, and now every system has it, you can use it. But for anything newer than 10 years, it's like extremely annoying and hard to use a C library. And then even if you can figure out your configure and your make files, like the memory allocation is probably gonna not play nicely with Postgres. So that's where Rust is kind of interesting, this PGRX. Like now there's this whole ecosystem of open source libraries that can potentially become extensions, and like we're still sort of at the very start of that, like just what's going to happen.
it's kind of scary because it could be very much of a Cambrian explosion with, what happens if there are 300 new extensions that are worth adding? It's a sort of a pain for the managed service providers to deal
definitely.
with that. So.
Yeah, and they can have funny incompatibilities.
Yeah.
I mean, it helps that then Rust is, a little bit more safe and a little bit more, not managed, but like the certain, like the memory allocation is a bit more sort of safe as well. But then, you can have a lot of weird bugs if you combine all these unknown bits of code.
Yeah. That's great. Are there any extensions that you've run across, either recently or in the past, that you love, that you would mention as exciting? I mean, you mentioned PostGIS, and anything else that you can think of? It's no big deal if not.
Yeah, I mean, there's many. I quite like. I'm sort of intrigued by Postgres ML. It's like this just machine learning extension that they seem to be doing a lot of interesting things. I don't have a good use case for it myself yet, but I really like what they're doing. Also in Rust, I think MIT license, so it can be used in a lot of places. There's of course like a lot of buzz around PG vector and more recently PG embedding, which is a sort of an interesting kind of development because now I think they both added this HNSW indexes, which are faster than the IFE flat indexes that PG vector provided. But then it also means they are now incompatible. You cannot, like with the latest versions, you can create one or the other, not both, which is a little awkward. But I think that is where, like, of course, one of the most fastest moving areas, and I think some of these things will be figured out.
Have you gotten those extensions added to the Citus managed service?
We definitely have PG vector. I mean, I think that took the landscape by storm. Like, I think they're pretty much on every managed service now.
It's interesting. Like, it'd be, we're working on this thing called Trunk, where we're trying to maybe I don't know if we can get you guys to participate, but the idea would be to like send some metadata to some sort of central repository that we'd know like which extensions are trending, waning, completely dead, or not. Like I just think like it's interesting as a new person coming into the Postgres ecosystem. There's just this library of potential extensions that it's pretty expansive and kind of trails off in a way, because you can find them loosely, here or there on GitHub, but I think having a better directory of them would be good for the community.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that's also tricky about extensions, it's like, I mean, you'd want it in an ideal world, you write it once and then it works forever. In the real world, it's like every Postgres version is like potentially breaks your extension. So someone has to actually go and fix it for new Postgres versions. I mean, sometimes it's okay. I think with pgcron, I had like once or twice, it's like, I think Postgres 16 didn't, actually, no, it did require some fixes. I think there was one Postgres version which didn't require any fixes, maybe PG 15. I was very happy, but usually, I mean, it's a sort of, C is a bit of this wild west of programming languages, but sometimes just some function header changes, there's an extra argument, and then, none of the extensions that use that function compile. So, like you have to have some level of maintenance behind each extension. Well, not every extension does.
Well, great. I mean, it was great to chat with you. Happy to have you back on again. If you have a big new release of Citus, I don't know. Do you guys have any big plans for it, or is it reached a certain point of stability where it is what it is? Yeah, I'm kind of curious.
Well, I mean, our most recent major release added this kind of notion of schema-based sharding, where because so far it's always been like you have distributed tables and you have a distribution column and you need to pick which columns you use. But with schema-based sharding, it's just like every schema becomes its own group, own shard essentially. So it might be on a different node. So for apps that use schema per tenant, that's a very nice model. And so that's that we're investing more in that at the moment.
Well, great. Good to meet you. Looking forward to continuing to get to know you, and thanks for joining us on the show.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me.